Very good. All right. Kind of sounds like the noise out there has died down, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. This session is being recorded, by the way, so the guy in the camera back there, just so you guys know. My name is Christina Clary. I am a library associate / genealogy researcher at the Davis County Public Library in Owensboro, Kentucky. Just to be upfront, I'm not a certified genealogist, but I have been doing genealogy research 8 hours a day, 5 days a week for about 6 years now. So I kind of know what I'm doing. I think I say that and then, I'll get messed up on something. But so intermediate genealogy. What do I mean when I say intermediate? Intermediate is going beyond a couple generations, although sometimes you do kind of get stuck even on just one or two. It's when you start getting into the family that lived before standardized records and the laws stating you had to register a birth or a death. So it's really when you start getting into the 19th century, and it's when your brick walls start popping up, and it's when you're gonna have to start getting creative and what you look for and how you look for it. So that's why for today's, we kind of needed basics in genealogy, because we're kind of skimming past all the early stuff on how to get started and getting to what to do when you get to brick walls. So for today, we're going to be going over looking at original images versus the indexes and transcriptions, deeds, church records, newspaper articles, specifically ones that aren't obituaries, some tips for researching Black genealogy prior to the 1870 census. We're going to very briefly cover adoption in Kentucky. It's one slide, it's very brief. And there'll be a couple of short clips on my top tips for searching Ancestry.com. And I'll kind of have little quick tips throughout the presentation popping up. Just to clear up some terms before we get started, original versus indexed. The original, when I say original image or original document, I mean the actual, if you can get the physical one, that's great, but the actual document as opposed to an typed index or transcription that someone has done. Records versus registers. This is going to pop up a lot when you look at birth and death before death certificates and birth certificates were required. Records are going to be for individual people, and registers will just have the lists of them. Especially in Kentucky prior to 1911, which is when Kentucky started requiring birth and death certificates, you're going to see more registers than actual records or certificates. Intestate means someone who dies without a will, and if you die without a will, you will have an administrator's bond. Decedent is another word for deceased, and a dower is land or property given to a widow. In Kentucky, the dower for a widow whose husband died intestate is half. Half goes to her, and then half is split amongst their children. And then for the deeds, grantors and grantees. Grantors do the selling, grantees do the buying. If you have to repeat that to yourself every time you go to the deeds, that's fine. I have to do it kind of like singing the alphabet every time I have to get to a letter. So if you only remember one thing from this presentation, make it be this. Always look at the original image if you can. Don't rely solely on the indexes and transcripts. This is not to put down indexers. I've done some indexing myself, and it's really, really hard. Mistakes happen. And two, if someone is not familiar with the area or the history and the families that are there, you can get some mistakes there. So the number one source of confusion I often find, and I come across with patrons, is they've seen an index or they've seen the transcription and something isn't right with it. It's off. Usually I tell them, well, have you looked at the original image? A lot of times they'll say, no, I haven't. We'll pull it up and look at it, and whatever is confused on the index, usually we can clear it up by looking at the original image. And two, if you're doing genealogy research, you should be looking at these documents anyway to verify the information with your own eyes. You don't want to solely rely on other people's work. You want to, a lot of people have done the research, and as long as they have the sources there for you to look at and also verify, that's important. So to help you remember this, There's Betty White when you don't look at the original image and you rely solely on the index. And there, oh, look, you looked at the original image and you found out your information, and Betty's happy. So remember this. Once you start getting to these older documents, you're going to get into all the handwritten stuff. You're going to want to start familiarizing yourself with these older styles of handwriting and their shorthand and their abbreviations. A lot of the ways they would write letters, like the actual physical, like the letter, is different from now. My favorite is the double S is a P. It's like a PS, and it took me so long to figure that out. I was so confused. I was like, MIPS? What is a MIPS? It's miss. And following the rule of threes, we're going to go over 3 examples of looking at the original image. So this is the 1940 census of my grandfather and his family living in Stanley, Kentucky. I think that's kind of easy to read, but about 4 or 5 years ago when I was looking for this census record, I could not find it. And I couldn't understand why, because I found all the other census records for them. The reason I couldn't find it was because the indexer put the name as Chari instead of Clary, and it wasn't showing up. Since I've found this, someone has added the Clary, and it will show up now. And also, as you can see, George Clary is Marge on there. I don't know how you get Marge out of that, but, mistakes happen. And one of the clips I'll show you later, I'll be kind of showing you how I search the census records to find this family. And when you're looking at census records, I always tell people give the ages on there plus or minus 5 years. Sometimes it could be plus or minus 10 years. Yeah.
You also need to be careful. My grandfather in the 1910 census is listed as a girl.
Yeah, that shows up a lot.
He's not answering age yet. He was still under 5.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes if it's not clear if the census taker is just kind of going off at what he sees or what he thinks, or again, people make mistakes. The way they write their numbers can get a little confusing. If you look at Alta there, she's 22, but there's some writing over it, and it can make it a little bit confusing. So this is why, again, you should look at the actual record to see what it actually says instead of just relying on secondhand information. This next one is a recent example that I was helping a atron with. She could not figure out Sabina Gore. So this looks pretty straightforward. This is during the time period when Kentucky required vital statistics, when you were required to report birth and deaths. They were into registers, although I have seen some certificates, but I'm not really sure what's going on with those. The problem with this is that Miriam Lambert is not supposed to be her mother. Her mother is supposed to be Sarah E. Hayes, and we know this from the marriage records. Jonathan Gore actually died a couple of years after Sabina was born. There's no way Mary Lambert could be her mother, and the patron was very confused, and I was confused. So I went and I pulled the record. Anyone see anything? Notice anything with this? It's hard to read. Sometimes I have to get magnifying glasses out, really, to help me. If you look at the right-hand column there, that's the mother's names. It's a little bit shorter than the other columns. So what happened is whoever was writing it down squeezed all of the mother's names and shifted them up. So if you look there, if you go straight across, there's Mary Lambert, but name above it, Sarah E. Hayes, the woman's actual mother. So this is one of those where the indexer, again, not to put blame on indexers, but you're just following what you should, which is you go straight across, but in this specific document, that's not going to work because of how the original document was written. And this brings up the double-edged sword of official records. We like to say, well, it's on the official record, so it must be right. Yes and no. Especially with death records, death certificates, it depends on what the person reporting it knew. If they didn't know, or if they thought it was this, that's what they said, that's what gets on there. It might not be right. When in doubt, the best thing you can do is get as many official records as you can, compare them, and go with what shows up the most. This last one is from a county record book that we have in our library for Davis County marriages. And if you can get a hold of county record books, they're great because they're usually done by people living in the area with a history there. So they're going to be more familiar with the names and the peoples there. I was trying to find a marriage for Sarah Catherine Dant. I couldn't find it under her name. There was no Sarah Catherine Dant in there, but I did find this Robert Payne to Sarah Catherine Dammit. That's D-A-M-I-T, that's what it says. There's the actual one over there. Again, I'm looking for Dant, so that's what I see. I guess you can get D-A-M-I-T out of that. It could also have been a typo when they were writing out the book.
Maybe in a bad mood.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe he had a grudge against the dance or something. But this too's, check out the source even if it doesn't line up 100%. Even though that name didn't look like what I thought it should be, I went ahead and looked at it anyway. I mean, the worst that's going to happen is it's not right and then you move on to another one. A lot of genealogy is a process of elimination. Deeds, when Grandpa bought the farm. There's Grandpa Cat and he is not happy about deeds because deeds are great, but they can be difficult. I'm going to say all these in a happy voice. To my knowledge, most deeds for counties are not widely digitized and distributed. You're going to have to go to the courthouse. I'm lucky in that for our county, we have them on microfilm in our library. Not all places have that, so you might have to go to the courthouse.
Searched its son. Damage search.
Yeah. I think some's on there. Unfortunately, of course, it's not the ones that I ever look at, but they're usually going to be in the basement. It's always the basement is where they keep all the records. They can also be really confusing when you're looking at the indexes for them. If they're, depending on who, the names that are on there are not always going to be exactly who owns that land. What name is it under? So often it'll be the sheriff's name because it was sold at sheriff's auction, but they're selling the land for another person. And then you have to actually pull that deed and look at it to get the actual owner's names. And they're really hard to read. They're so hard to read, those deeds. And if you're trying to trace land, the boundaries make no sense. Has anyone ever read like an old deed, the boundaries? It's like 10 poles to the white oak tree on Jones's farm, and then half a pole to a rock in the creek. And it's like, okay, I get why people were fighting and killing their neighbors now. Someone moved the rock and they know that. You can find so much genealogical information from them now. You wouldn't think that when you think deeds, you just think land, property, tracing, boring. But there's so much stuff that you can get from them. Land, especially farmland and rural areas, tended to pass through the same family. Even if you're looking at a deed and you see that it looks like it's passing out of the family, a lot of times I'll look at it, it'll be a daughter and her husband under their married name. You get things like affidavit of descent starting around the 1920s. You get deeds of trust, where people are setting up trusts for grandkids or their children. Deeds of divisions and partitions, where people are splitting the land amongst their heirs. And you get power of attorneys that show up in deeds as well. You get a lot of stuff that shows up in deeds, besides just land transfers. If you can't find a will for someone, check the deeds. A lot of times, I know I will be looking at a very prominent person in the community with lots of land and they don't have a will. And it's like, how does a rich person like this not have a will? We went into the deeds and it was all settled through the deeds. Basically the deeds where he's sorting out who gets what of his land and all of that. That's where it was. So if you can't find a will for someone, check the deeds. So affidavit of descent. There were mandated in a Kentucky statute in around 1942, but I've seen them show up before in the 1920s. I tried to research this, but then it got all legal and my eyes started rolling in the back of my eyes. So this is part of what the statute says, and it's what's required in the affidavit, but basically it's the person, when they died, were they married, single, widow, where they lived, did they die intestate? If they have an affidavit of descent, yes. And the names and addresses and ages of all of their heirs. So you get this really nice document where you find out, this is for H.D. Mattingly, who died in 1938. You get his widow's name, you get his kids' names. One of his daughter preceded him in death, and so there's her husband and all of her kids because her share goes to them. And this is called a direct lineal heirs as opposed to collateral heirs. Collateral heirs is when you kind of go outside of the immediate family. So for example, if he had died single with no children, it would have gone to siblings, and that's considered collateral. And like I said before, in Kentucky laws for intestate, people who die intestate, it's half to the spouse and half amongst the children or their children if they have died. This is a deed of trust from Heiress Throckmorton naming Isaac Everett as a trustee. And when you're looking at deeds, it's all standardized. So once you kind of know what the deeds are supposed to say, even if you can't read the handwriting, you know what it says anyway. It's almost kind of a fill-in-the-blank thing. So in consideration of $1 and of his love and affection for his son Colin and his wife and children. If you see land being transferred for $1, it's most likely to a family member. Sometimes if there's another neighbor and they're swapping lands that are roughly the same amount, they'll do with $1, but it's usually going to be a family member. And then the love and affection for his son, that is standardized. That's what they say in all of them. I was actually helping a descendant in the family who said that Iris and Colin didn't actually get along all that much. So can anyone make a guess on why this deed of trust was written?
He didn't like the son and he didn't want his son to have the land.
That's part of it. What else? Look at the date. Civil War. Colin in the 1840s served in the Navy. Around 1861 to early 1862, middle-aged men. You're going to see a lot of stuff like this. You're going to see wills pre-written. Again, it's going to be the middle-aged ones because the older ones aren't going to be drafted and the younger guys don't have the stuff, or they just, 18-year-olds don't think about writing wills. So you're going to see a lot of things like this in wills right at the start of the Civil War, people kind of preparing for the war to start or it has started. I've seen one will where the person wrote the will because of the invasion or because of the invader Abraham Lincoln has invaded my lands. I am writing this will. So, this is a deed of partition and division. It's also a commissioner's deed because an outside party, the commissioners had to step in to kind of divide the land. This is dividing up the land for J.N. Hinton. It's dated 1861, but Hinton actually died in 1864. He was part of the Daviess County Home Guard and got into a skirmish with some Confederate guerrillas and was killed. But as you can see, they're not doing this until 7 years later. You get his widow's name, and then these are all of his children here. And this deed actually goes on for 5 pages because it was a lot of land, but then you get these fun drawings over there. And with this, sometimes you will see this where it's siblings going to court and getting the land from siblings. It's not always going to be acrimonious. Pretty much all of these children were minors. So if children are minors when their father dies and they get this land, the land is willed to them, it's not uncommon to see any siblings that are over 21 having the land transferred to their name. Also, I don't know if you can notice that there, but they made a mistake and had to mark it all out. So again, official records aren't always going to be perfect, infallible information. People make mistakes. Deed of conveyance. Remember Sabina? Well, once we clarified who her mother was, we then ran into the issue of, okay, what happened to her? We found her in one census with her family, and then we couldn't find her again. Part of it was I went into the deeds, just looking at her brothers. She was the only girl in her family, to see if her brothers had any land given to them. And I discovered that the mother had actually remarried. We didn't realize that because she's buried with her first husband and she's buried under her first married name. But once we clarified that, we had the name. And in this deed where I discovered the mother, that there was a Lucinda Daniels listed, but no Sabina Gore. And so I went back to the deeds, looked at the Gores again. I found J. Henry Gore. I found this deed of Lucinda Daniels and J.T. Daniels, her husband, to J. Henry Gore. And lo and behold, somewhere in that scribbles, it says that Lucinda Daniel, late Lucinda Gore, as child and heir at law of the late J.B. Gore, deceased. This is Sabina. If anyone remembers, her initial in that birth record was L. At some point, Sabina stopped going by Sabina, started going by Lucinda. She was named after her grandmother, so maybe they just didn't like the grandmother. Once I found this, and this verifies, essentially, this is as close to a verification as we're going to get, that this is the Sabina Gore, the daughter of Jonathan Gore and Sarah Hayes. Once we did this back and forth with the patrons, we figured out what happened to her. When she was 15 or 16, she went to Shawneetown, Illinois to elope with her stepbrother, J.T. Daniels. She ended up having at least 2 daughters and then died in 1894, I believe. She was only 30s and 40s when she died, and we found her headstone as well, which was her date, all of her dates, including her marriage date on there. So from this deed, we were able to find out what happened to a woman in the late 1800s. Anyone who's done any sort of genealogy research knows how hard that is to do. I call it the missing women problem. It's from the 1880s to the 1900s because we're missing that 1890 census. So make sure you check every possible permutation of a name. People used to go by their middle names a lot more than they do now, and that's because, everyone was marrying Elizabeth and Sarah and John and William and Henry, or they just didn't like their name, but people went by their middle names a lot more, and spellings of names as well. Daniels, Daniel, the S, missing the S. So every possible way you can spell a name, every nickname you can think of for a name, check those. This is a commissioner's deed, and it's hard to read, and I kind of did that on purpose so you guys can get the idea of how sometimes these can be really hard to read. Commissioner deeds are usually for settlement of estate disputes, distribution of deceased estates, mortgage defaults and foreclosures. You're going to see a lot of this starting actually in the 1920s to the 1930s. And for the older deeds, they're going to be sold at what are called sheriff auctions. It's when the sheriff would essentially get hold of the land and sell them at auction, and those count as commissioner deeds. The later ones are going to have this kind of fill-in-the-blank standardized form. And also, just to clarify again, it's not always going to be acrimonious. You see people going to court, suing for land and all of that, suing their cousins or something like that. It's not always going to be like that. A lot of times it's just clarifying things or that sort of thing. This deed was actually very useful in that we were able to identify some collateral family to Charles and Samuel Hathaway. They were part of a prominent black barbers and businessmen in Owensboro. Their father actually started the business in 1855 in Davis County. I'm assuming he was a freed slave. And There were, I believe, 8 children. 4 of them died under the age of 10. 2 of the remaining 4 were killed, murdered in their teens, in the early 20s. And then the last 2 lived to older ages, but only one of them married and none of them have children. And this commissioner deed came about after the last one, Charles Hathaway, who was at one point considered one of the richest black men in Owensboro, died. Oma Hathaway is his sister-in-law. Since he didn't have any children and went to her, everyone else listed on there, that's his aunt and cousins, all suing the sister-in-law to get the hold of that money. It didn't work out for Antonia, though, because she got it, and as soon as she got it, all the cousins turned on her and then tried to get it from her, and then she died. So, and when you find these in the deeds, you can go back and look in the papers. They're going to be written about a lot in there. Land transfers are in papers as well. So, church records. For Catholic and Episcopalian churches, you're going to get baptismal records and registers. Catholics especially, you had to, if you wanted to get married in the Catholic Church, you had to have a baptismal record and you had to show it. So they like records. To find these, you can go to diocese archives, which if anyone doesn't know, parishes in an area are all grouped under a diocese, and then they're grouped into a larger thing. It goes with the Catholic hierarchy. Individual parishes. If you're looking for Episcopalian church records, you have to go to the individual parish. They don't have their overriding organization doesn't have those records. So you'll have to figure out which church they went to get those. And then Protestant, which I didn't know how else to group I didn't want to say non-Catholic because that would seem a little rude. You get letters that are proof of memberships. You get membership rolls, Sunday school rolls, and baptismal certificates. Now these are going to be harder to find because it's going to be kept with the pastor or the secretary or just someone who randomly got the records. They're going to be kept by an individual person, usually. And you also look into church histories. If your ancestors were one of the founders of the church, they're going to be written up in that. So on the left is a Sunday school record, membership roll for Bethlehem Baptist Church in Utica. This was a small black church that was formed by the freed slaves in that area after the Civil War. We have some of their records from 1906 to 1910. And if you look at it, it's a list of names, but you get the family units. In pencil, you can see dates of death. Sometimes there's other notes on there that I don't quite understand, but this gives you the families and you get death dates out of this. On the right is the Sunday school records for Sargo Baptist Church out in Sargo, Kentucky from 1939. You get the students, and some of them actually have their birthdays listed on there. These are a couple of baptismal records. On the one on the left, I don't know if you guys can tell, but the top half is written in English and the bottom half is in Latin. It depended on the priest, if it's English or Latin. So if you're looking into Catholic records, you're going to want to know basic Latin, or at least have a good translator for it. You can usually figure out what it's trying to say, though. Godparents are frequently going to be family members. If you see the same couple being the godchildren for another couple's kids, that's probably going to be a family member, and it's worth looking into them. And on the right, we have, this is a transcript of it. I'm highlighting this one. This is one that my coworker found. She was trying to find a Ruth Fitzwilliams who was born in the 1870s. She was adopted by another family. When she went to the index, there wasn't a Ruth, but there was an Anna. But she went ahead and checked it anyway and found this where it says she is the daughter of James Fitzwilliam and Mip Aldridge. And it says she was adopted by these people. So we have all of that right there. There's Ruth. She's under a different name. She's Anna and then Agnes. And where Ruth came from, we don't know. But we found it. You can get a lot of stuff out of these baptismal records. If people are twins, they mention that. They mention if they're illegitimate. I know in our records here for St. Lawrence, there's a couple pages missing. And there was apparently a note written that the priest who got the records after the prior priest left was horrified by all of the slander that was written in these baptismal records. And so he took them out and left a note saying there was so much mean stuff written, I just couldn't leave it in there. And so now we don't have those pages. And also we don't get to know the hot gossip from that time. Newspaper articles, besides obituaries. If you want to know about obituaries, come see me. I have a whole nother presentation just on obituaries. Other things to look for in the newspaper are marriage announcements. You're going to want to look in the society columns. They're usually called About Town, or you can look at neighborhood news where they have community news for the smaller communities in the area. You want to get as many names of people associated with your ancestor as possible. You want to know who they're hanging out with. If they're living out in the rural area, they're hanging out with their cousins or their in-laws, because that's who's there. You know, there's not really, in the smaller communities, at some point, every family's going to be connected to another family. But if you've got an ancestor and you're having a hard time finding anything about them, get names associated with them and look into those people. Try and find out how those people know your ancestor to try and clarify, find more family connections. This is especially good if you have someone and you think you know who their parents are, but you can't find anything that explicitly says who their parents are. But you find a sibling and you find records explicitly saying who the sibling's parents are. This is when you're going to want to try and connect that person to their sibling. One way to do that is look in the newspaper articles. This is about a family reunion, which is awesome because it tells you straight away that these are people who are all related to each other. Now this is a dinner party that someone's holding for their cousins. Again, you're getting so many names, and it's being, you know for a fact that they're all related because it says so right there. This is a 3-line sentence. From this 3-line sentence, I was able to find 3 women that I could not find previously. I got lucky that Alphonsus went to visit his Aunt Cleo and not Aunt Nancy or Aunt Elizabeth, which again, if you're having a hard time with a family, pick the person with the most unusual name. Look into them. It's going to be easier to verify that it's them than if you're trying to find an Elizabeth Smith in records. This is a marriage announcement talking about a marriage that happened in 1898. If you're trying to look into that sibling bond, marriage records are a good place to go. By the late 1800s, early 1900s, you're going to start getting less family members on those, but like the earlier ones, your witnesses are going to be family, usually a sibling. And also the attendants on this, Arnold Knott and Miss Mary Moran, they ended up getting married to each other a couple years later. Find that happens a lot, so that stereotype started a long time ago. So, Black genealogy before the 1870 census. This is when you're going to be looking, if you're looking in southern states, this is going to be when you're looking to when they were enslaved. And there's not going to be a whole lot of records verifying their family. One thing you can look are wills, estates inventories, you can check slave schedules. The Civil War, you can check the Union military records. I found some great stuff in those. You'll see that in a few minutes. Freedmen's Bureau records after the Civil War. Those are a treasure trove. You can find them on Family Search. That's what I've been using. Unfortunately, they're not indexed yet, so you have to go page by page and then read all about what's going on day to day. And then you get to the 1870 census. We're not really going to talk about that. You just need to be aware that after the Civil War, a lot of the formerly enslaved changed their names a couple times. They didn't want to necessarily stick with the name they were given, first name or last name, and they also might have moved around a little bit. I've found a lot of people who I can find them in all the other census, can't find them in the 1870. I don't know if it's because they were somewhere else, wouldn't think to look, or if their names are just so different that you can't find them, but you have to be aware of that. And before we go further, I do want to just kind of warn you guys that when you get to these older records, it can be very upsetting to read how they wrote about human beings as property. So I may say some of the stuff and it may seem fine, but you don't really get used to it. At least I haven't gotten used to it yet. Some of the racist stuff you can find. There's always a new racist thing you will find that will shock you. So I call this an immigrant oath. Couldn't actually find an official title for what this is. In 1814 and 1850, Kentucky passed acts banning the importation of slaves explicitly for the intent of selling them. Anyone who moved into Kentucky had to sign an oath or an affidavit saying either they had no slaves and had no intention of selling slaves, or if they did, they had to list who their slaves are. Sometimes they'll give the ages, sometimes they won't. But these are also good if you want to try and verify when an ancestor came to Kentucky. These are not things that I've seen a whole lot before. I actually came across this for the first time like a couple of weeks ago. Wills. On the left, we have the will of Joshua Griffith. He died in 1845. He lists an Edmund, who he refers to as my yellow boy. From that, we assume that Edmund is either a son or a grandson, maybe a nephew. It could have been a favorite slave of his. He was a little bit eccentric, so doing this wouldn't be out of place for Joshua. He frees Edmund when he reaches the age of 45. He gives actually the date. We think he gives like a date of his birth date and states that Edmund at the time of the writing of the will is 23. So that would put Edmund's freedom at about 1861. What happened in 1861? Civil War. Edmund would have been freed anyway, though Joshua didn't know that. There's Henry. He gave Henry to his daughter Sarah. We actually have this family's papers, original documents from the early 1800s in our collection. I've found letters about his daughter giving the slave to his granddaughters, and the granddaughters writing to grandfather, talking about how, we decided to swap Henry for Mary with Uncle William. So is that cool? Not really, but. And there's Alan, who he just straight up frees in this one. The one on the right is for Adam Shoemaker, 1827. He frees all his slaves after his death. Mingo is freed. Vina is freed in 1830. Any children she has before 1830 get freed when they are turned 30. The slave status of children were based solely through the mother. So if the mother is enslaved, the children are enslaved. If the mother is free, the children are free. A lot of times you will see when slaves are freeing their families, they will sometimes focus on freeing the mother first. Because you free the mother first, then any kids that are born are going to be free and you won't have to free them. There's Benjamin, who's a son she already has. He gets freed in 1849. Charles is freed in 1853. And Peter is freed in 1845. I'm assuming, based on the age given to Vina's future children, that this is all when these people are turning 30. And he actually gives specific dates in those years. So we can kind of assume we get their birth dates from this. You just kind of count back from the years given. These are enlistment papers from United States Colored Troops. This is for George and Robert Moss. They lived in Henderson County, Kentucky. It gives where they're from. It gives their age. And at the bottom, their owner's address, Mrs. Sarah Moss in Henderson, Kentucky. So once we found these, we verified what farm to look at. And getting from this, you can go to a slave schedule. There's Sarah Mops. Again, the double S is a P. She's right there. Down here, we get Samuel Mops, her son. He has 2 male slaves that are age 18, which would go with George, who is listed as 23 in 1865. Sarah has 2 male children age 10, who would be 15 in 1865, and those could be Robert. Slave schedules only existed for the 1850 and 1860 census records. Sometimes they will give first names. It depended solely on the enumerator. I've not seen a whole lot of first names for the slaves on there. What county is it? Somewhere in like eastern Kentucky, I've seen slave names on these slave schedules, and that's the only place in Kentucky. But this is a slave compensation claim of Philip Thurman in 1864, and I believe again in 1866. Congress passed acts to basically compensate slave owners for the wages and labor lost when their slaves enlisted in the Army. Philip, unfortunately, wouldn't have been compensated because they ended that right around the time he filed his claim. Poor Philip. Freedmen Bureau records. Are you all familiar with the Freedmen Bureau? Who they are and what they did? Okay. And for anyone who doesn't, the Freedmen Bureau was established after the Civil War to help the enslaved, essentially. It gave them a place to go when they needed help. Like I said, a lot of these are on Family Search. They're not indexed. You get things like, you can find marriages, you get schools. A lot of Freedmen Bureau schools were built right after the Civil War. You get guardianships and apprenticeships. You can find out murders of people that I didn't know are not in our records that we have, but I found them in the Freedmen Bureaus. Get pension records, people reclaiming property, and you just get kind of an idea of day-to-day life after the Civil War. And then the top left is a marriage record. Slaves before the Civil War were not legally allowed to get married. Any marriages they had were not considered legal in the eyes of the law. So after the Civil War, you will see people. This one says they've lived in the state of marriage for 2 years. Sometimes you'll see, and it'll give an actual number of years that they have been considered married in those. On the bottom right, or the bottom left, is a pension record for Philip Harold, who served in the Union Army and died, and it lists his children. So it was the people who actually should have been compensated for his service instead of his former slave owner. And on the right is a letter from the Freedmen Bureau agent in Owensboro to the head office in Louisville about parents trying to find their son, George Davidson, the son of Milton and Caroline, his wife. In this, it also mentions that Milton was the former property of Daniel Griffith. Davidson is not Griffith. So we like to think that all former slaves took their former slave owners' names, and they did not. There's an example right there where they didn't. Their son George was forced into service with a chaplain in the Union Army. This chaplain was captured by John Hunt Morgan during one of his raids, and the family hasn't heard of their son since. They've heard rumors that he might be with some people in Georgia. They're trying to find their son. And I looked, and I don't think I ever found a reply, so I don't know what happened with the Davidsons, if they ever found their son. He was 15 the last time they saw him. Adoption in Kentucky. Kentucky is a closed adoption state. records are sealed, and you need a court order. That's pretty much it if you're trying to do modern adoptions in Kentucky. If you do research for someone, or if you yourself want to find out, you're going to have to get a lawyer involved. I will tell you this though, there will be 2 birth certificates, one for the biological parents and one for the adopted. So if you're trying to find who grandma's parents were, the birth certificate numbers are going to be the same. So if you have we call them the black books, the vital statistic records that were issued. I think there's a set of them in the Kentucky Historical Society. Basically, if you know the date and the year, you can search until you find the matching birth certificate numbers. You also get guardian bonds in the 1800s. Orphan home records. They're usually going to be religious organizations. And just to clarify real quick, orphans in the early 19th century don't necessarily mean both parents are died. Father dies, you're considered an orphan. The mother either has to apply to be a guardian or she's got to get a man to be a guardian for her children. And families tended to take in family, especially in rural communities. You see a lot of great nieces and great nephews living with their great aunts and uncles. So I'm going to do real short clips, they're about a minute each, of my top things that I'm looking for when I'm helping patrons, finding children of a mother in the Kentucky Birth Index, finding a death certificate by date, and searching the census records by specific district. All right. So when you go to Ancestry, you go to search and you get all of these categories here. You're going to want to go to all categories, and it brings up to where you can go into each state and you can see all of the records within each state. I find it's easier to go in. You can see Kentucky there. You can go to the main ones we use are the death records, the birth index, and the death index. You can go directly and search directly into the birth index. What I like to do is I will type in the mother's name, and you go by her maiden name. If you know where she lived, you can type in the county. Sometimes I will do the last name for the children of her husband's name. And you can see there, the top 4 results are all the children of Dorothy Haynes who were born in Davis County. So if you want to know how many children a woman had, if she had them after 1911 in Kentucky, this is one way that you can do that. And of course, birth certificates aren't available to the public. You have to get those from the Office of Vital Statistics. This is trying to find a death record, a death certificate. I found the death index for Floyd Tucker. He died in 1962 on May 29th. Could not find a death certificate for him. Well, I'm going to go directly into the catalog there, the record catalog, and I'm going to search it by the date. And it didn't get the pull down options there, but I'm going to type in the date and the place and then just see all of the death certificates that have that date in that area. And even if you don't have a specific date, even if you have a month and a year, you can search it that way too. So the top 3 results there are all 3 people who died on the same day in Owensboro, Kentucky. The middle one is Thomas Tucker. It's not Floyd. Go to the record, it says Thomas. So what do? I look at the actual image and see that it actually says Floyd. Thomas is his father. They just accidentally repeated his name, father's name. The last is, I'm going to show you how I found the Clary family in that early 1940 census way back when. So you can go directly into the census there and go through about 6 or 7, click 6 or 7 things to do that, or you can just go right over there and click on the 1940 census. Over here, where it says Browse Collection, you can choose the state, and again, it doesn't show the pull-down options. You can choose all of the counties that were there in that time period. There's going to be less the further back you go. You can get populated place, so it's going to give you all of the main cities in that county, the main townships. For this one, I went with other places. And then you get the enumeration districts. That first one there describes Stanley St. Peter's, which I know the family lived there. That's where they lived for most of their lives. And so now I'm searching directly in that specific district's census records. You can just go by that, or you can pull up the index there at the bottom and scroll through that. I went page by page, but I went ahead and looked. They're on page 15 there, and there they are. So if you know where a family lived specifically, but you still can't find them, it might take you a while. You might have to go through a lot of pages of census records, but you can find them. So, in conclusion, look beyond the standard birth, marriage, death records. Mortgages, military records, settlement records, local histories, diaries. Even if they're not related to your family, they might mention your family member in it. City directories, workplace ledgers, records. Don't keep searching the same information over and over again. That's how you go crazy.
Where do you find workplace ledgers and records? Is that a category to search on Ancestry?
No, that's something where you're going to have to call if they work like a big corporation or something, or if business. I always suggest calling the local library first to find out what they have. If you can't find a person, look at someone else in their family that you know is in their family, or just a name connected to them near the family. If something doesn't make sense, double check the source, because you should be always looking at the original image. So, thank you guys for coming out. Are there any questions?
I just have a kind of question and comment. You ever run across the totally wrong name on a birth certificate?
Totally wrong name? What do you mean?
My mother has always gone by her first, always gone by the name of Anita.
Mm-hmm.
When she applied for a passport to go overseas when her dad was stationed overseas, there was no child by that name born to this woman. Got to looking, and her birth certificate has a completely different name.
It could be that the parents changed their mind.
It was her aunt.
Oh.
Told the doctor the name that she wanted last name,
Mhm.
to be named.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that before where we couldn't find it, and then we talked to the family, and they're like, oh, yeah, we called them that for a couple months, and then we changed our mind. There was another question back? Yeah.
I've just got a comment on her. My uncle, his father named him at the courthouse, his mother named him at the hospital. He ended up with 6 names.
Yeah.
Four down, Peter, our school, they called him Jimmy.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was a
Yeah.
census taker, and I can tell you the census records are not correct.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm not, I had a customer come in and they were looking for DAR information.
Mhm.
They're going 2 and 3 generations back under the great grandfather, paternal side. And we were not able to find any death record or anything, so we kind of worked sideways, siblings.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you can use newspaper articles. Does DAR accept like marriage announcements in the newspapers?
When I said you can use them at personal research, if you're applying for any sort of society organization, if they live in a time period where there's just not going to be a record, or they lived in a burn county, which is a county where the courthouse was burned and the records are just destroyed, I think sometimes they might take newspaper records. I've been helping some people with some DAR applications, and they are very, very, very stringent in what they accept. Yeah, if that's the only thing you can find on that, maybe they might.
Do you have any, I guess, helpful hints on, my mother's Puerto Rican, so with the Spanish names,
Mhm.
I'm searching for that. Is there any, like, you come across that or have any?
I actually watched something on Roots Tech last week on Puerto Rican census records. Are you looking at the double surname?
Well, just because, because, they keep their
Yeah.
mother's main name and carry it with it, so
Yeah.
that causes so much confusion in doing the research.
Yeah, they suggested that look under the double surname and then look under both of the both of the surnames individually. So you can try that and see if that gets it. Any other questions? Yeah.
Would you be willing to share slides?
Yeah. If you want a copy of it, just come meet me in the back and we'll exchange email addresses. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Thanks.